Welcome to From Here to Eternity, a Gateway Seminary podcast about the nations. My name's Phil. I'm a professor here at Gateway. Until recently, I lived overseas for about 20 or so years. But now here I'm at Gateway, and in this podcast, we address topics related to the cross-cultural spread of the gospel from here in California, across the U.S., and throughout the world. Today, we have David Rathel. He is a former pastor. He's current professor of theology at Gateway, and he's the director of the PhD program. David has done wonders in the PhD program over the last few years. He's a well-loved teacher here. He's brought a European PhD to Gateway, another one of our many. And with that, he's been able to do lots of different things in the classroom that many of us only dreamed about doing. And he's also been able to propel the PhD program to a level that it hasn't been in a long time, if at all. So, David, thank you so much for being here.
No, absolutely. Thanks for the warm introduction, Phil. You're a good friend, and I'm happy to be with you and happy to talk about life, ministry, and theology. It's going to be a fun time together. I think a lot of you feel Dr. Hopkins does a great job here as our missions professor, and it's been a joy to serve alongside him.
Hey, David, let's just dive into first thing I'd like to ask is how did you come to faith in Christ? I mean, who are you? And just share your testimony with us.
Yeah, sure. So my father is a Southern Baptist pastor heritage. He was a Southern Baptist pastor for all of my childhood and up into my teenage years. When I started to transition to college, he was still a minister, but he became a professor. And so he was kind of a pastor theologian type who taught at the Baptist College of Florida. It was known then as in Graceville, Florida. And so suffice it to say, all of my life, I grew up around the SBC, but most importantly, I grew around the gospel. And so we heard the gospel preached from my father's pulpit every Sunday, and we heard the gospel taught at home. And then later, whenever my father became a professor, he continued to instill in our family, the teachings of Christ and make sure the plan of salvation was known to us. But suffice it to say, despite all of that knowledge, as a young man, like many pastors' children do, I rebelled against kind of the gospel and against the church. I think part of it for me was a desire to find my own identity. And when you're a pastor's kid, when you're searching for your identity, that means whatever your father is doing, you want to do the opposite. It's about carving your own path in the world. And so I spent my teenage years, away from the church, away from Christ. But it was a moment when I was a senior in high school when I was involved in a really bad car wreck. And honestly, it just terrified me. And I did not know, how I survived, but thank God I did. But that moment of peril caused me to reflect and think about what would happen to me should I have died, and what's the meaning of life, and where do I want to go, and how do I want to spend my life, and where will the current trajectory that I'm on lead me to one day? And all of those things were racing in my mind. And so Sunday morning after the wreck, I went to a small church near my home where the gospel was being preached again. But at that moment, by God's grace, I heard it fresh and anew. And I really pegged that time as a pivotal moment in my life because I prayed to the Lord, I've been away from you. I've been rebellious towards you. If you would have me back, I would love to come back. I'd love to be with you. And my life just changed dramatically. And suddenly I was well known in school for being completely different from who I used to be. And then that set me on a path eventually for ministry and things like that.
Okay, so God saved you through in many ways, a tragedy. And that's something I'm just going to dive into this because I'm going to talk more about your life here in a little bit, but I want to kind of dive into how God uses suffering to bring people to himself. And that kind of leads to a question that a theology guy like you would be able to help us out with. When we see in the scriptures with Christ in God becoming man in Christ, it leads to some questions about the ideas of immutability and impassability. How can God, who we say is unchanging, but then how can he suffer for his people if he's really immutable, or if he's incapable of suffering? How can he be impassable? Can you walk us through some of those? Because it's really God used something tragic in your life to bring you to himself. But then how does this work with this idea of impassibility and immutability?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. That's one of the key questions in theology. And so a lot to say about it. And certainly we can only say so much in a podcast. And so I want to give a caveat that this could be hopefully the start of a conversation for a lot of people, if people are interested in this. And I do want to also give an advertisement as well as a caveat that this is a very important topic in theology, and it's a very important topic for ministry. So thanks so much for bringing it up, Dr. Hopkins. I think on the surface, some people find this to be abstract and not related to ministry because we use words like impassibility and immutability, and those are not words we use often in church for whatever reason. But when you actually start to parse out what this means, everyone goes through suffering in life, and everyone wants something pastorally relevant to say to someone who is suffering, and how we present God to a suffering person, and in particular, how we present God's engagement with someone's suffering matters. And we want our theology to be in place well so we can adequately represent him and proclaim the truth to people who are having questions and doubts and fears and who are experiencing trials. And so immutability is exactly what you just said, that God is not subject to change. And impassibility is a reflection on that idea, or rather an inflection on that. And it just simply means that God is not subject to changes in emotional states like humans are. And one way to think about impassibility is that it's something like an apophatic qualifier. And I know we're using now a lot of words, but to parse down what they mean, apophatic is by way of negation. And it's a way of talking about God by describing what he is not. And then qualifier just means this is language that helps us to have the right language when we speak about God. It qualifies our speech about God. And so what we're doing when we're talking about impassibility is we're simply saying we can't fully describe and comprehend the divine essence. But one thing we can say is that God is not a human like us. By way of negation, God is not a man. And so because God is not a human like us, he's not subject to emotional changes in emotional states as we are. And so there's a permanence and a constancy to who he is. There's a sense of completion, we'll use that word, in himself and his inner life. And there's a sense in which he is the creator, transcendent over his creation, not beholden to his creation, so that his creation doesn't have the opportunity to actualize who God is or what it means to be God. And so impassibility and immutability are exactly what you just said. Just to summarize, God does not change, and that includes God does not experience changes in emotional states.
Okay, so when someone loses a parent or loses a father or something tragic in their life happens, how is that helpful? How is this idea of impassibility and immutability helpful in pastorally? How does this work out?
Yeah, pastorally, it helps us first govern our speech on what not to say, but it also gives us great resources on what to say. So what not to say would be, at least in the classical Christian tradition, something like this. Well, God is here suffering with you too. Mm. And we've probably all heard some pastors or some ministry leaders with sincerity say something like that. But that would be very different from how the early church and so many theologians in the church's history have read the Bible. And so we don't want to present God as a co-equal sufferer. Now, to be sure, we can talk about this later. There are theologians today who've made those claims, but their minority report exists in the broader stream of Christian tradition, which says, no, God does not suffer. But secondly, not only does it help us say what not to say, it helps us say something. And that is, God is the transcendent one over our suffering. And there's a great article by a theologian I love named J. Todd Billings. And Billings has suffered for years with significant health problems, including a serious bout with cancer. And he's reflected on all of his experiences as a Christian theologian. And he was reflecting on the fact that he was one day in the hospital taking chemotherapy, exhausted, at his wit's end. He'd been suffering these health conditions for so long. He just had no more energy. And he was just reflecting on all things on God's impassability. And what he said was, I'm glad that, and this is my paraphrase, while I'm here in the hospital and my emotions are racing, I'm afraid, I'm angry, I'm scared, I'm tired. Like, God is constant. He is the rock. And so God is not suffering here with me. God is the one who is transcending my suffering. And he's the one I can cling to as the permanent one who's stable, who's always in love with me, who's always providing care for me. And so regardless of how I feel in my emotional states as they change every day, God is stable throughout my journey with cancer and my suffering with cancer. And he said it was the impassible God, not an idea of God suffering with him, that actually brought him through all those trials. I think it's a really beautiful testimony.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Tim Keller was going through some of his, I think it was when he had pancreatic cancer, he said something similar to that. It was the fact that in many ways that the God standard doesn't change, his emotional state doesn't change. And just because, we live in a fallen world and our feelings aren't as real as they may seem to us, are just as fallen as everything else in the world. But how do you we talked about this at another venue, but how do you address passages like, say, Philippians 2, in Matthew, when Jesus cries over Jerusalem, desiring that they would come to faith in Christ, but they're not willing? This seems to, at least on the surface level, there's a lot of emotion going on with that, and Jesus changing from to God to man, to 100% God, just 100% man, 100% God. How do you work all that out?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's the next phase of the conversation. You're right. So who is God? He's immutable. He's impassible. He lives with joy and life in himself. He's perfect in all of his ways, and he's complete in all of his ways. But we also say as Christians that this God, who is eternally blessed, who is eternally immutable, took on a new nature, which is not divine nature. It's human nature. And that's the incarnation. And so the eternal Son, while retaining his deity, added, as it were, for lack of a better phrase, to put it colloquially at least, a new nature, which is a human nature. And when he became human in that way, to use this phrasing of becoming human, again, speaking colloquially, when he took on this new nature, all of the properties attending human nature were in place and true for him. And so Jesus of Nazareth experienced emotions as we do. He becomes angry and clears the temple. He becomes sad when Lazarus passes away, his friend. The shortest verse in the Bible that we all had to memorize as children was Jesus wept, which is how you won RAs and GAs, for those of you who were in RAs and GAs whenever we were kids together. And so Jesus did experience changes in emotional states. As the God-man, he was not impassible at all. And that's why places like Hebrews can say he was in all points tempted as we were, but yet without sin. And he can now sympathize with us in our weaknesses. And so what we say is this, and in Christology, is that the person of the Son, the who of the Son, is the acting nature in the human nature, or excuse me, the acting person in the human nature of Jesus. So that God as man suffered, or God as man died on the cross, or God as man wept or experienced joy. And so it's not that deity changes. There's no change in God in terms of the incarnation, but it's God as man can experience change. God as the acting subject in the human nature of Jesus experiences all the things humans experience. And so to me, what Christianity gives you in terms of just the practical pastoral payoff is a transcendent God who is above our suffering, who's a rock, but also a very near God, because the transcendent God, without relinquishing deity at all, took on humanity and became one of us. And in that way, he knows what it's like to suffer, to die. He knows what it's like to be rejected by friends. He knows what it's like to experience the relational trauma of living in this world sometimes. All of the things that he that he endured for our sake, to sympathize with us, in part to sympathize with us. And so it's a God who is both above and near. And that's, I think, the beauty of the gospel.
That can lead to a lot of complicated issues, right? And just people have gone off on various tangents with that, and unfortunately have distorted that relationship. Can you talk about how, like, some of the more dangerous and unhealthy distortions, and compare them to more what theological orthodoxy would be?
Yeah, sure. I give two examples. The first example comes from the early church, which is an example called Nestorianism. So Nestorius was a bishop of significance. And what's interesting is that he was a self-proclaimed, as it were, heresy hunter. And so he wanted to stamp out heresy from the church, and inadvertently ended up becoming labeled among the heretics himself. But what he was trying to do was he was trying to uphold the idea that God is impassible and immutable. And he was struggling with the idea of the incarnation. And so what he did was to uphold, with a sincere good desire to uphold the impassibility of God, is he, as it were, divided the person of Christ. So that, as it were, Jesus' human nature and Jesus' divine nature, to put it colloquially, had little to do with one another. It's almost as if they're running on parallel tracks. So it's two acting subjects instead of one. The human side is doing this, or the divine side is doing that. And the problem with that view, although it on the surface seems to make sense, God is staying God and humanity is staying humanity. The problem is that there are two natures, deity and humanity, but there's only one person. And the person of Jesus can't be divided. And so it's God as man who brings about our salvation. And the threat that Nestorianism brings to the gospel is that this God as man bringing salvation, that idea is severed. So it's deity is doing this and humanity is doing that, to put it colloquially again. And so it's an incomplete understanding of the gospel ultimately. And that's why the church ultimately rejected Nestorianism. And they said, what we want to say is it's the person of the Son, one person who's now the acting subject in the human nature of Jesus of Nazareth. And so in a mysterious way, without dividing the person, this one person is operating in two natures. And that's how you can say God as man suffered, or God as man wept with Lazarus. And so one of the problems in the early church was this dividing, well-intended, but it had consequences for the gospel, this dividing of the person of Christ. Or more modern confusion would be someone I actually have tremendous respect for, and that's the great theologian Jürgen Moltmann.
I was going to wonder if you're going to mention him, yeah.
Yeah. And Moltmann went through the horrors of war and really wanted to create a theology in the wake of the horror that he saw. And he wanted a sympathetic God. And so Moltmann, to make a long story short, took the suffering that we attribute to God as man and brought it into the divine life, into God himself. And I've always respected Moltmann, but ultimately I've always felt also that the classical position will give you everything that he wanted. God as man did suffer. God as man knows what emotional experiences are like. God as man was tempted. And so God can sympathize with us in that way, without having to say that God has to, in some way, change within himself. And so those are kind of two examples.
So would you say that Moltmann almost adopted a more of a monophysite type of theology, or is that a bit too strong?
Yeah, great question. There's been a lot of things charged with Moltmann. Ultimately, Moltmann will get you to something akin to panentheism. Okay. And so the boundary between the God-world relation is blurred. And so God takes creation into himself and into his own life, and it shapes what it means to be God. And so it really is a significant theological difference from a classical approach.
Okay. Well, back to monophysitism in a minute. That was kind of the rejoinder, if I remember right, to Nestorianism, right? There's this one nature is all mixed up together. Why does that not work?
Monophysitism.
Yes.
Yeah. Monophysitism, it depends on how we define it.
Sure.
It's a difficult term to define, as you know. And so it kind of depends on who we're speaking about in particular. But in general, what Chalcedon was trying to do was trying to say, well, deity has to say deity, humanity has to say humanity. And so we need two distinct persons. And the unity comes about not through the mixing of natures or the unity of the natures, but rather through the unity of a person, the acting subject of the Son. And so to kind of put it simply, that was at least the dividing lines between the two. Yeah.
Okay. So I asked Sean Wilhite this question. So I want to ask you this question as well. So back when, not in a podcast or anything, he and I were just talking, and I asked him about monophysitism and Nestorianism. Can one who adopts those positions, they're like the Copts in Egypt and the Jacobites and the Church of the East and Assyria, would you consider them just theologically, perhaps, sub-Orthodox, but still like Christian? Are like, because at the end of the day, are they in heaven or are they in hell?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah. It's a significant question. Yeah. And if someone's listening and doesn't know these terms, just to help, Chalcedon is a church council codified in 451 that really helps to outline the Christology that I'm describing and the God-world relation I'm describing. And there were groups, especially in the East, that did not affirm this statement of Chalcedon, and they had a different Christology. And I've said before, I'm very open to those groups, and I'm happy to recognize those groups because there were historical factors in place that led to their rejection of Chalcedon. And so while it's not the theology that I teach or proffer to my students, what they were following many times was in the wake of Cyril of Alexandria, who provided a lot of theological architecture for Chalcedon and beyond. And there are certain phrases in Cyril of Alexandria that can be taken very easily in a monophysite direction. And so these people are finding themselves to be careful exponents in their minds of the Cyrillian tradition that they're inheriting. And also there was tremendous hostility from the Chalcedon proponents at times to the East. And that difficult relationship that developed, and even the hostility that developed, caused positions to be even more hardened over time. So there's just so many historical factors. And so I just think we have to be gracious and contextualize these conversations in history well.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned politics getting involved in religion and how detrimental that can really be. And we see that in history. We see that today. It's unfortunate. It is what it is, but it's still unfortunate. It can kind of cloud our views some. Back to Christology a little bit. What are some of the dangers you see today within the evangelical community, broadly speaking, that perhaps don't adopt the Orthodox or historic form of Christology you're describing? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, great question. I think just baseline, a lot of people in our communities don't even have conversations about immutability or impassability. I think we often use language that presents God as if he suffers at the popular level. And we never stop to think about the fact that, well, through adequate Christology, we can talk about Christ sympathizing with us without ever having to literally say that God suffers or that God himself, as he is God, changes. And so I just think in terms of these conversations, a recovery of an adequate understanding of God would help with an adequate Christology. Augustine has some great lines on the Trinity, but one of the points he makes emphatically several times in the book is that when we read the Bible, we have to kind of purge our minds of corporal reality when we are thinking and speaking about God. And so the scripture will present God in, as it were, corporal terms. Augustine quotes Psalm 17, where it talks about God hiding us under the shadow of his wings. But we know that God literally doesn't have wings. He doesn't have a body. He's spirit. And so Augustine says that's the same process when we read text about God being angry or God having to repent. And so Augustine says that we have to read the Bible in a God-befitting way and purge our minds of what he calls these falsities. And it's going back to what I said earlier about impassibility is an apophatic qualifier, reminding ourselves that God is not like us. And so the statements, I am a jealous God or God relented, they're meaning something. They have theological import, but they're not taken literally, just as we don't take God as a rock or God has wings, literally. And so I think just an adequate hermeneutic so we can read the Bible in a God-befitting way, is helpful. Augustine said these languages, these metaphors are mere pedagogical allurements, right? Because we only understand corporal reality. God speaks to us and accommodates to us, but it's for teaching purposes to call our attention to his greatness above and beyond us. Yeah.
So I guess what you're saying is, in a sense, is that we read the Bible, phenomenologically in a way. We read it just like we don't believe the sun sets and sun rises. There's a lot of these illustrations that we read, but sometimes we take these phenomenological illustrations, we kind of make them more. I mean, say literal is not the right word, but we kind of make them a little bit more wooden to appear to mean something that the authors really just didn't intend to mean. If I'm like kind of summarizing what you're saying.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So back to how politics and religion kind of intersect and all that. You lived several years overseas in the United Kingdom, and you got out of the American world for a bit. How has that impacted your understanding of the U.S.? How has that helped you be a better minister and a better pastor while with your experience living overseas?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, thanks for asking. I'm still in some ways reflecting on that myself, to be honest. Yeah, my family and I lived overseas for 4 years in the UK, as you lived with your family in the UK. My daughter was born in the UK. I think for me, it helped me understand America better, rather interestingly, because if this is your default home, you're just a fish swimming in that water and that's all you know. This is normative for you. And so then when you go overseas and you cast your eyes from the pond back to America, you start to see your home with different eyes, with the great things that are here, but also the challenges that are here. You become a more astute observer of your own culture. So I think number one, for me, it just helped me to be a more critical, careful interactor with American culture and understand what life is like here. I think number two, it helped me to see a different expression of Christianity, not in the sense of a different religion by any means, but a Christianity that was operating in a very different social and political context. And there were things that I learned from the Christians on the ground there that were very helpful. Christianity was not necessarily as politicized, at least among many of the evangelicals we knew in Scotland, like it is in America, and things like that. And there was much more patient, deliberate theological reflection than sometimes we see, because the U.S.'s default philosophy is pragmatism across the board, and that applies for church life in the U.S. as well. And certainly conversations about practice have their place, but we can't be just completely pragmatically driven. And so I learned just the value of theological reflection being over there.
Yeah, that makes, it's one of the things with the UK, we as well have just fell in love with the system in many respects. In many respects, that the Christianity over there is the UK is, I guess it's safe to say, is a bit more socialist than here, even in California, right? And that's reflected positively and negatively in the church, just like the materialism here is as well. But with that said, you've been doing ministry now for what, good 20 years or so. 10 years as pastor, you're going on 7-8 years here. And what's one thing you wish you would have known earlier in your ministry career that you know now?
I wish I would have known who you are matters more than anything else. And I say that because that's a cliche, and I was told that so many times as a young pastor. But as I get older now, I'm just realizing how profoundly true it is, because the older I've gotten, and I am by no means old, for the record, despite my follically challenged hairline here, I am not old by any means. But just living, you see, in the short time I have, pastors who've fallen away, friends who've fallen away, scandals, and these were super gifted people. And I'm just challenged by the fact that it doesn't matter the size of your platform or whether you're known or not. It just matters who you are with Christ at the end of the day. And so just like a warm heart to Christ, a warm heart for people. Don't be pursuing ministry out of selfish ambition to be known. Pursue it just out of genuine love for God. And then ultimately, God is faithful, and he can raise people up and give people opportunities. And if we're faithful with a little, he can give more. And so I think just the patient work of the ministry is like tried and true method of Christian faithfulness.
Mm. You're well read. You got a PhD from one of the a quite respected theologian at St. Andrews. You could be doing anything, and you're here at Gateway Seminary. I mean, you could pretty much write your ticket to wherever you wanted to go. But you're here at Gateway. Why are you here at Gateway?
Yeah. So me personally, I'm from the American South. We lived for 4 years over in the UK. And when we decided that we were going to come back to America from the UK, we started to kind of probe and explore opportunities and regions where we would want to live. And personally for me, I did not want to go back to the South. I have family in the South. I am by no means against the South. I'm brought up in Southern culture, right? But for me, I just wanted to do ministry outside of the American South, outside of the American Bible Belt. Mm. And whatever that looks like, California is the exact opposite of the American South, right? So whatever California is, it's the opposite of the South. And so for me, I cast my eyes when I saw this opportunity at Gateway come open for a theology professor. I started to look at Gateway seriously. But having lived here now several years, I can say with all of my heart, I love California. You know this about me. Yeah. I am a champion of California. I love California as only someone who is not from California can love it. And so I love the diversity here, the ethnic and cultural diversity. Dr. Hopkins and I live not too far from each other. And just in the short span of a drive between our houses, you pass by who knows how many different types of people groups represented. And so just for ministry, it's exciting. It keeps you on your toes. It's a blank slate in some ways. You're not beholden to cultural traditions. So I love ministry in this context, and I love dealing with people in California. And I love the honesty where if someone's not a Christian, they don't have to put on a facade and pretend they are to be socially acceptable. They're just not a Christian. And you expect non-Christians to act like non-Christians. And then you can have conversation together about what we believe. And I have not found hostility here. I'm not saying that hostility doesn't exist. I've just found confusion here. And I found people who are willing and open to talk about stuff and what I believe, theology, the gospel. And then they'll tell you what they believe. And it's not the gospel, but you can have open conversation with people. And so for me, what keeps me here is that ministry setting, that place, and just the sincere goodwill that exists at Gateway as people are working together to do ministry here.
Yeah, that's a good point. You just don't, I mean, people just, they don't, I don't want to say it's indifference, but again, confusion is probably a better word than indifference. I think the UK, probably a bit more indifferent, but here is just more like confusion. People don't, because so many people call themselves, there's a lot of different, call themselves a bunch of different things, right? So when you say you're a Christian, it's always a good conversation. It's a good conversation to have with people, and you can do that perhaps here better than you can in other places. You're coming out with a book, or you're in the process of coming out. You came out with one like last year. Is that I remember correctly?
Yeah, that's right. So it's the book from last year is called Andrew Fuller and Faith Worthy of All Acceptation, and it's a play on Andrew Fuller's most famous book, Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation. And it's really just looking at Andrew Fuller as a pastor theologian. I was a pastor for years before I ended up being a seminary professor. And I wrote my dissertation on Fuller because I wanted to bring the two worlds together, theology in the academy, but also theology in the church and for the church. And there shouldn't be a stark divide between the two worlds. And so Fuller was at least an exemplary model on how the two can come together, because he was a theologian operating in a church context for his church context. And so that's that book. It's by T&T Clark, so it's very expensive. So if anyone's interested, they may want to use an interlibrary loan or use a local library to get it. But a new book that's coming out probably at the end of 2026 will be a book on Christology. And so that's why we were talking some about Christology here. It's with B&H Academic, and it's going to be just an introduction to the tradition in terms of doctrine of God, how that impacts Christology, and then how that impacts how we speak of God, and then how we do ministry. And so we'll talk about not just monophysitism, but, monothelitism, and why that's also in the tradition at least incorrect. We'll talk about divine simplicity and impassibility and how we should consider God, but we'll also talk about modern theologians who revise those doctrines and or at least skew them in different ways. And so I've got a section on Barth where we talk about Barth's divine actualism and his understanding of God that's very different, but interesting and worth knowing. We have a section on some of the more revisionist approaches beyond Barth. So, yeah.
Hey, can we talk about divine simplicity for a minute? I think that's a fascinating topic that when you say that, talk to us about that, because many people don't understand what that term is.
Yeah, so divine simplicity honestly has been in the background, lurking in the shadows the whole time we've been talking here.
Yep.
And so because we believe in divine simplicity, in part, we believe in immutability and impassibility as well. They're all together cohesively standing as one. And in fact, because God is simple, you can say, and many people have said, although this is contested, that all of his attributes are one. So that love and holiness are distinctions that we make in our predications toward God, but they actually don't exist within God himself. So that impassibility just would be immutability, just would be simplicity, etc. So in terms of simplicity, a simple definition, and the irony is, by the way, that simplicity is very hard to define simply, but a simple definition is God is not composed of component parts. But what the idea there is that simply God is not a composite. God is one. God just is who he is, as it says in Exodus, or as James says, there's no shifting or shadow turning with God. And so God has a moral constancy that's tied to his nature. He just is who he is in terms of his nature being, for lack of a better phrase, stable or constant. You think about Hebrews, where Hebrews talks about it's impossible for God to lie, and God making a covenant with his people in Hebrews chapter 6. God's moral constancy there in Hebrews chapter 6 is tied to his ontological constancy, who he is. And so this is all a package deal. And so the reason I'm pushing on those buttons about moral constancy, etc., is they relate to simplicity in this way. God doesn't have parts or sections where there's a part of anger and then another part of love, or there's a part of I may, have this emotional state for this person, and then I have this emotional state that differs now the next day for that same person because of their sin. God doesn't have sections or regions or parts. He's not composite. He's not a body. He's a spirit. And this goes also for the triune life as well. And so all of this is packaged together to just really uphold the fact that God is the enduring one. Different and above and beyond his creation. A way to put it maybe that might be helpful is the way that Aquinas put it, where he said, look, God is fully actualized. And so there's no potentiality in God because he's simple, where he may move from potentially being in love for someone or towards someone to now expressing love or being in love. God just is love fully actualized. Because of his simplicity, he just is who he is. And so this is related again to impassibility and immutability, because this is just the permanent, enduring God who is just the God of love, the God of holiness, etc., the God of the Bible. Yeah.
Okay, how does this relate to then the Trinity? And do you see what I mean? There's no connection, but I'd love to. Maybe I'm not saying that right.
Oh, that's a great question. No, it's definitely connected. So, like John of Damascus, who was a great theologian of the East, he explicitly unwinds his doctrine of simplicity in his conversation about the Trinity, as does Augustine in De Trinitate, and as do the Cappadocians. And so for the early theologians, simplicity is tied inextricably to conversations about Trinitarianism. It's only in modern theology that we start to see people try to divide these two, or see even for some people contradiction, where you can't have simplicity and Trinitarianism. But it's at a popular level, or a simple way to put it, you can put it this way. Father is not part of God or a section of God, because God's simple. He's not composed of component parts, right? All that it means to be God, the Father is. Mm-hmm. The Son's not a part or section of God, a third of God. All that it means to be God, the Son is and has. And so simplicity is sort of a grammar. It's a governing structure to help us think through God's divine life in the right way and Trinitarian theology in the right way. So if simplicity is in place, there are certain things we can and certain things we cannot say about Trinitarianism. And so for so many of the theologians of the early church, simplicity is guiding and directing how Trinitarian theology is developed, because they see simplicity as just simply an expression of God's oneness. As I said, the book of Exodus, I am who I am. God is his nature. As I said, his moral constancy on display in the Bible. One way to think of it would be that God doesn't take accidental properties. He just is this. He just is who he is. And that's important framing as we speak about his oneness. So the oneness needs to be in place adequately so we can address now the divine persons, Father, Son, and Spirit.
Okay. Now, how does Barth differ from this? Because Barth, for those who don't know, founder of New Orthodoxy, he, it was in a very, quite theologically liberal context and brought people back to more of a Orthodox context, but still not what we are as Bible-believing evangelicals, but still, closer to us than. So how does all this work out with Barth?
Yeah, so Barth's really interesting, very interesting. And I like Moltmann. I have tremendous respect for Barth. And I enjoy reading Barth, as I enjoy reading Moltmann, and I think we all should. But for Barth, what Barth will say is that he holds to, say, impassability or immutability in particular, but this is revised in his schema so that God actualizes himself to be the one for his creation. God has divine freedom, and God is free to be the one for creation. And so what Barth says is there's no really conversation to be had about a logos, a sarkos, which means a word without flesh. And so in the classical tradition, you can speak of the Son as Son even before the incarnation, because the Son is the eternally generated one from his Father. What makes the Son Son and not Father is the fact that eternally in God's life, the Son is from his Father. And so there's language there of begottenness, fromness that we really need to preserve in terms of the distinction that the Son has from his Father. And so what Barth would say, without denying the sonship, is he would say, well, we just, to give a very charitable interpretation, without following some later interpreters of Barth, we can't have that conversation about the Son without the incarnation, a Son without the flesh, because we only have the God as he's come to us to be in Christ. And so for Barth, all of theology is a conversation that's Christocentric. It's focused on Christ. This is the God for us. And so for Barth, everything gets revised. And so there are now questions about, what does Barth think about simplicity? What does Barth think about these things? Because these concepts are rewired, not denied, but rewired, to the point that Barth even says that the Son is eternally submissive to the Father. Well, that sounds a lot like the evangelical position, eternal functional subordinationism. And the joke has always been that if the evangelicals would read Barth more, they may actually found an ally. Those who hold that position found an ally in Barth. And so that idea is certainly debated often in Barth scholarship, what he meant, but it's certainly just on the surface not coherent with a more classical understanding of God. So,
Okay, I should have asked this question earlier, and it's probably the simplest question that I'm going to ask you. But why is Christology important?
Yeah, great question. Christology is important first for fun, and then for actual real practice. For fun, Christology lets you play with a lot of different theological categories. So we've been talking about Christology, but we've been talking about doctrine of God and who is God. We've also been talking about salvation and the gospel and what it means for God to save people and what has to be in place for the gospel to be effectual. We've been talking about ministry practice out of Christology. Does God suffer, and how do we explain God's suffering? We say God suffered as man, not that God suffers as the divine one. And so Christology is like this nexus point for so many different pieces of theology. So it's just helpful and fun. For significant theological work, I just feel like Christology in our circles, evangelical circles, is underexplored. And so we've had around 2016 a lot of debates over Trinitarianism, and now a lot of discussions about doctrine of God. But I think we're now coming to the point where we're going to start to have conversations about Christology, because we've had people in evangelicalism, and it's no slam I'm making whatsoever, so please don't hear that, who've had different understandings of God or different presentations of God that don't cohere with a more classical model. And so now that we're working through this, that's now shaping what can we say about Christ and what should we say about Christ. So I think this is the next frontier that needs careful thought and reflection.
Oh, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Kind of a more practical question for you, as a former pastor and current seminary professor. You've seen a lot of people, we've all had, that have gone to seminary that think are going to do well and end up not doing well and falling away and all that. But if you could, if for someone thinking about seminary or maybe in the process of being in seminary, what's one piece of advice you would give them as part of their seminary journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would just simply say, do the best you can given the pressures you're under. And that sounds really funny or strange, but it's not a cop-out to do shallow work. Just the reality is that most people in seminary are now, at least in these days, having a husband or a wife or children they're taking care of. They have a job because things are so expensive. They don't have the luxury of working part-time. They're usually working full-time somewhere. And so it's just, seminary is a duty amongst many other duties. And we have to do triage to find out the best way forward. And God expects our best in seminary, but he also expects us to be the best mom or dad we can be, or the best pastor we can be. And so what it may mean for some people is that the best they can do is not an A. And again, that's not an excuse for shallow work, but it may mean that tonight we have to be in dad mode or mom mode. And I think just giving ourselves the freedom to recognize that seminary is an opportunity. It doesn't have to be a burden. And seminary is a blessing. And so I get to study the Bible here, and I'm going to enjoy seminary. But at the same time, my identity is not found on whether I get an A or a B. I just need to do the best I can given what's on my plate and soak up as much as I can, and then God is pleased. Now, having said that, if someone does desire even further study beyond an MDiv, then it's worth making certain sacrifices and balancing schedule out for PhD or THM study, because that matters. But for most students who are not thinking about PhD or THM advanced study and just wanting to be faithful missionaries or pastors, make it a blessing and not a burden.
If there's one book that you could recommend people to read, or one book that out of all that you've read that has impacted you the most, what book or a couple books would that be?
Oh, that's a great question. Honestly, it depends on the day, So if we do this tomorrow, we have more books, maybe they show up. Right now I would say the people who've influenced me a lot are some of the early church writings. And so I've really enjoyed Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa. I've really enjoyed Augustine. And I think for me, they opened up a view of theology so that it's not just theologically profound and sophisticated, but it's beautiful. It's a vision. It's a theological vision that's beautiful. And it's in places imaginative, and it's rhetorically beautiful and forceful. And so I think reading those works would do people well, because you're seeing really just the glory of not just these people's minds, but the glory of their piety and their rhetorical prowess.
I asked a missionary that similar question. He came up with a similar answer. It's he says, one of the things that I like to do is I like to read biographies of missionaries, and in the same way, maybe not as theological, but you see the theology, and especially in the older missionaries, it kind of comes out through their biographies and how they process. And it's okay to read works that are challenging to read. They still can be worshipful and devotional, even if they're at a different academic level. And I think that's very much a blessing. Is there anything you like to promote? Is there anything? How can people pray for your ministry? How can people support what David does at Gateway?
Oh, no, thanks for asking. I think prayers as we finish the Christology book and take on other projects that have kind of been on the back burner because of the Christology book. So prayers for that we can finish strong and finish well, and it would be a resource that helps people. And then always prayers for the PhD program. As you said, thank God it's growing, and we rejoice in that. We give God the glory. And so we just want to see continued growth, but most importantly, continued health. And I think if it's healthy, it will grow. And we want to see the fruit of growth. But what matters most is that students are cared for, that there's academic rigor, that it's a spiritual community, that it's a healthy community. So just prayers for the PhD program.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, David, with that, I think I can, I can, maybe you can't say this because you're the PhD director, but I can. I think I can say that out of the seminaries that are around California and in the SBC seminaries, that Gateway has, if not the most robust, at the top of the list. We have, 4 guys from St. Andrews. We have a guy from Cambridge, a guy from King's College. We may be getting a guy from Helsinki. I don't know where that's going with. A guy finishing up a degree from Catholic University, which is like the Oxford of Belgium. And we have a guy from Durham.
Yeah.
That's like 9, 10 European PhDs mixed in with, we have the traditional Southern Baptist PhDs too, which is beautiful too, right? Because there's this mix. Am I right in saying that it's, in many ways, it seems like the best kept secret at Gateway Seminary when it comes to because it's a great program that you've been able to build up. What am I not seeing?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I can't take credit for all the faculty being here, but I'm grateful they're here. And yeah, to be sure, there's a great European influence here of guys from top shelf universities who've come here to teach. I think the California location has something to do with it. I think the fact that Gateway is a peaceful place where people can just engage in careful biblical studies work or theological work, I think that attracts a certain type of scholar and academic and even a certain type of student. And so, I think if someone comes here, they're going to be very well supervised by people who were supervised well in a European model that prioritizes supervision and academic rigor. And so what we're trying to replicate here are really the best pieces that many of us received overseas while still being faithful to an American degree and upholding the advantages that a distinct American degree can give to PhD students, because there are advantages to the American approach as well to a PhD. And so it's a strong European influence here, still embedded in an American PhD, and it's a beautiful thing to see that I'm grateful for. And what's interesting is our colleagues who've not gone to European schools are also very proficient. And so we've got here a legacy at our school of John Selhammer, who's very well known and respected Old Testament scholar. And his legacy, interestingly, continues now with 2 Old Testament faculty here, Kevin Chen and Josh Matthews. And both Kevin and Josh have taught at respected institutions beyond Gateway and outside of Gateway, but have now recently come back to Gateway because it's a chance for them to be home teaching in the school they love. And so they give the students that distinct Selhammer approach to Old Testament studies, which is also very respected as well. So it's a fun place. In some ways, we are a best kept secret because we're in the Pacific coast and not in the Southern Baptist heartland. But we are happy to serve the West and all who come.
Yeah, I mean, again, for all the things that you've done with the writing and the teaching, in many ways, you've been able to build on a foundation that Wegner and a few others before you have built. And the Lord's blessing your ministry and blessing the PhD program. And that's to the Lord's credit, and it's to yours as well for God choosing to use you. So thank you for all your work you do at Gateway, and thank you for the time. Thank you. You're super busy. You give me an hour of your time. I don't want to take up too much more, but I did want just to say, thank you for having this conversation that, and using terms that many of us don't know, but need to know, and hearing it from an expert is just a benefit. And hopefully we'll be able to process this some more. And if you have any questions, I can always put you in contact with David because you love I know you love talking about this.
That's great. Yeah, absolutely. Book recs, if you're interested, Thomas Weinandy's book, Does God Suffer? It's a classic book on divine impassability. It's over about 20 years old now. Really a great read. You were asking about Christology and impassability. This is a great work, Divine Impassability and the Mystery of Human Suffering. So it's an edited collection. Thomas Joseph White did it. He's a great Roman Catholic scholar. And then at a much more kind of popular level, this book has some polemical edges that I don't always agree with, but it is a very well-written book and a well-done book. All That Is in God by James Dolezal. Just a basic intro to simplicity, immutability, and impassability. And I think a lot of people would enjoy that. We mentioned Aquinas briefly. This is a volume that came out recently, The Unchanging Love of God. It's a reflection on Aquinas, on impassability, and it kind of upends some of the stereotypes people have for Aquinas. So.
Yeah, that's funny because you would never think this Roman Catholic was, so, that'd be a fascinating work to read. Thank you, David, so much for your time, and we'll connect soon, I'm sure, later.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Dr. Hopkins.